$50.
50 for her?
She's not for sale anymore. I want her to be my wife.
They sold all Arapaho girls at auction. Only one was left, until a silent rancher offered his name. Laramie, Wyoming Territory, summer of 1872. The sun beat down like a glowing knife, slicing the cloudless blue sky and scorching the wooden planks of the town square until they splintered, releasing the scent of dried sap and dust. The sour tang of men's sweat mixed with tobacco and horse steam thick in the air like a curse. This was a place where hopes took flight and dreams withered, where men were harder than stone and silence could cut skin. All eyes were fixed on the raised wooden platform, the warped planks creaking faintly under the weight of the moment, the air heavy with heat, and the musky scent of too many bodies crowded together. The auctioneer stood in the center like a man conducting a cruel symphony, his voice booming above the low murmur of the crowd. Each barked number and shouted bid flung into the air like stones. Sweat gleamed on his forehead in tiny beads, trickling down his temple and catching the afternoon light before disappearing into the folds of his neckcloth. And there at the very heart of that spectacle stood Wa-Nene. Her wrists were bound in front of her with coarse rope, the fibers biting into her skin, leaving faint red marks that throbbed with every small movement. She held her chin high, as if defiance alone could shield her, but her dark, bottomless eyes betrayed the truth eyes that caught the light like black glass, yet reflected the raw terror of a cornered animal, one that knows there is no gap left in the snare. She was only 18 years old, but in the set of her jaw, in the quiet resignation around her mouth, she carried the weight of someone who had already lived more than one lifetime. Her buckskin dress, once soft and supple, had been lovingly embroidered with glistening beads by hands that knew her name, her history, her place in the world. Now, the beads were dulled, the stitching frayed, patches of dust clinging stubbornly to every fold. The skirt hung limp and tired, as if it too had given up hope of catching the wind. Her hair, jet black, still holding the sheen of youth, was braided tightly into two plaits that hung down her back, the strands drawn so firm it pulled slightly at the corners of her temples. The braids, neat and unbroken, seemed like the last remnant of order she could keep in a life overturned. Since the day she had been taken from her Arapaho people, Wa-Nene had not spoken a single word, not to the men who bound her wrists, not to the woman who shoved bread into her hands the first night, not even to herself in the darkness. Silence had been her armor, her refusal, and yet standing there on that platform, with dozens of eyes crawling over her like the legs of insects, that silence began to feel less like a shield and more like a cage closing in. She did not cry. Crying would have been a kind of surrender she could not give them. But every knuckle on her bound hands was white, the skin stretched tight over bone as she clenched her fingers into a fist so hard she could feel her nails pressing half-moons into her palms. It was the only betrayal her body allowed, the only sign that fear lived beneath that stubborn stillness. The crowd shifted, boots scraping the dusty ground. There were whispers, men appraising her as if she were livestock, their voices thick with the laziness of those who know they hold all the power. She could hear them through the auctioneer's shouts. Strong shoulders, she'll work the fields. Look at those eyes worth a bit extra. Pretty enough under the dirt, maybe more than field work, eh? Laughter, low and mean, rippled through the men standing at the edges. She could feel it, each sound hitting her like a handful of sand thrown in her face. She kept her gaze fixed just above their heads, refusing to look at the ground, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her search for an escape that wasn't there. The auctioneer's voice rose, a sharp bark cutting through the heat. 18 years old, strong as she is young, good for labor, good for service, good for— His pause was deliberate, his eyes flicking toward a group of men near the front, whose smirks told the rest of the story. The words that followed dripped slower, heavier, whatever work you see fit. A ripple of chuckles and knowing glances spread through them, and Wa-Nene felt the weight of their gaze move lower, as if they could peel away the thin buckskin with nothing more than their eyes. She tightened her fingers around the rope, binding her wrists, the coarse fibers digging deeper, scratching, biting. The pain was sharp, grounding. It kept her from swaying, from collapsing into the heat that pressed against her from all sides. Memories flared in her mind, quick, bright bursts that stung more than comforted. Her mother's hands smoothing the buckskin dress across her shoulders. The laughter of her younger brother chasing the dust along the riverbank. The sound of drumbeats at night, steady and safe. All of it was too far away now, each memory muffled as though she were hearing them through a thick wall of ice. $5 to start, the auctioneer barked, one hand raised, his voice slick with eagerness. Her pulse jumped. That number, the measure of her, hung in the air like a brand, marking her as less than the mule tethered outside. A man near the front raised his hand lazily. 5. The auctioneer wiped his brow with a dirty handkerchief and continued to yell, his voice sharp as a blade. Come on, still here, young, healthy, strong enough for light work. Who'll take her? A man in the crowd spat, a rough, barking cough breaking out. Not worth a cent, he muttered. Just a bowed-head Indian girl. Another man sneered. She'll be dead by winter. Not used to this life. Laughter rang out, thin and cruel, crackling like dry kindling. The women avoided Juanena's gaze, as if her look was a curse. They looked at her like a strange beast, a creature both frightening and pitiful. The auctioneer yelled again, his voice filled with impatience. Come on, this is the last one. Don't leave me with this invisible burden. He patted her on the shoulder. How about $2? $3? Anyone go higher? A terrifying silence fell. The wind stopped blowing, as if listening. The sound of boots approached, slow, heavy, and certain. James Morgan stepped out of the shadow of the saloon awning, 32 years old. Tall, thin, a worn black jacket, and boots caked with dust. He walked like a man who had lost more than he spoke, and he carried that loss in silence. A widower for 5 years, no children, only a small farm 3 miles east of town, with horses and the wind for company. He stopped at the foot of the platform, squinting at Juanena. His eyes held no curiosity or lust, just a difficult-to-read thoughtfulness. After a moment, he spoke in a low, even voice that echoed through the silence. I'll pay $50. A murmur spread through the crowd. The auctioneer blinked, not believing his ears. $50 for this? She's not for sale anymore, Morgan said calmly, reaching into his jacket, pulling out a worn leather wallet, and counting out the money. I'm not buying her to work. I want to give her a name, my name. I want her to be my wife. The whole square held its breath. The wind stopped as if waiting. She doesn't speak English, someone whispered. James slowly turned around, his sharp gaze sweeping over the crowd. Neither did my grandmother. She still built a home, raised 5 children. We understood her perfectly. The auctioneer's lips curled. Are you serious? Morgan put his hand on the platform. I don't play games. Juanena looked down at him, her eyes confused. His gaze met hers. Not hungry, not cruel, but steady. She didn't understand the words, but something in his eyes conveyed a powerful message. You're not a piece of merchandise at the market. You're a person. The auctioneer muttered and declared. Sold to Mr. James Morgan. Morgan motioned for the deputy sheriff to step forward and cut Juanena's bindings. She rubbed her wrists, blinking in the sunlight. Despite the strangeness of it all, James didn't touch her. He waited until she looked at him. Then he tilted his head, gently as if to ask, Ready? She gave a single nod. He led her through the crowd. People silently parted. Some stared with judgment, others with disbelief. Juanen walked beside him, not behind. She didn't say anything, but she held her chin a little higher. At the wagon, James invited her to sit in the covered part. She hesitated, then climbed in. He took the reins without a word, and the cart rolled forward, away from the square, away from the auction block, away from the gazes. Juanena sat stiffly, hands on her lap, her heart pounding. On the long, bumpy ride out of town, James only said one thing. You're safe now. She didn't understand what it meant, but the way he said it, soft as a vow, made her believe it. And for the first time in weeks, she let out a sigh of relief. The wheels creaked beneath them. Dust rose like smoke in the fading light. James held the reins with one hand, his other hand resting loosely on his lap. He didn't say anything, his eyes looking straight ahead. The girl beside him, small, still wrapped in that old buckskin dress, clutched a cloth bag on her lap, as if it contained her entire world. Wanena didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, her back stiff, her eyes staring at the horizon. Her knuckles were white from gripping the strap. James glanced at her a few times, measuring her silence and tension. She hadn't said a word since the auction, not even when he helped her onto the wagon, not even when the town was far behind them, and the wide open plains had swallowed them. By the time the simple log cabin came into view, surrounded by a barn and 2 old corral fences, the sun had set low, casting a golden hue over the valley. James stopped the wagon and climbed down first. He didn't offer a hand. He figured she wouldn't want to be touched. She hesitated before following, stepping down carefully, clutching the bag to her chest. Her eyes swept over the surroundings. The chicken coop, the woodpile, a plume of smoke curling from the chimney. There was no one else, no voices, just him and the wind. James walked ahead, then stopped on the porch. "Your room is on the left," he said. "There's warm water in the basin." Wanena didn't reply, but she walked past him and slowly stepped inside, as if expecting a trap. He watched her disappear behind the door, then let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Inside, the main room creaked with her light footsteps. She didn't explore. She just stood in the corner for a while, then knelt to place her bag beside the bed. The room was small but clean, a single bed, a window, a wash basin, a chipped cup holding a withered sprig of wildflowers. Maybe his late wife had once tried to bring it home. Maybe it was James himself, in his clumsy, wordless way. In the room, Wanena dipped her hands into the basin, wincing at the cold. She washed her face, then her hands and arms, scrubbing away the dust from the town, from the wagon, from every hand that had touched her since her capture. Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't cry. In the main cabin, James moved quietly, building a fire, taking off his boots. He ladled stew from the pot into a bowl, but didn't touch it. The appetite that had brought him back to Laramie was gone. He stood by the fire for a long time, arms crossed, staring into the flames. He could hear her movements, soft, careful. Maybe she was too scared to sleep. He couldn't blame her. When the fire died down, James took a blanket, opened the back door, and went to the barn. He didn't even consider taking the second bed in the house. That would feel like he didn't deserve it. The horses stirred as he entered. He found a spot in the straw near the wall and spread out the blanket. The smell of hay and old pine hung in the air. He lay down, staring up at the rafters, letting the ache of the day sink into his bones. Inside, Wanena was curled under the blanket, eyes wide open in the dark. She hadn't taken off her boots. She heard nothing but the crackling of embers and the creak of the wooden floor. No footsteps, no heavy breathing from the next room, no man in the dark. She crept to the window and looked out. In the moonlight, she could see the outline of the barn door closed, and behind it, a faint orange glow flickering through the cracks. He was out there. She didn't fully understand what he had said, but she understood enough. He wasn't sleeping in the house. He was giving her space. She returned to the bed, wrapping the blanket tighter and pressing her cheek against the pillow. The scent of cedar was faint and unfamiliar, clinging to the fabric. Her eyelids felt heavy. The silence didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like the first kindness. Morning came early in the valley, long before the sun had fully risen above the hills. The sky was a muted pink and gray, and the first birds wheeled over the cottonwoods. Wanena moved like a shadow across the yard, barefoot, a shawl wrapped tight. She carried 2 metal buckets, one in each hand, filled with cold water from the stream that ran near the backyard. The doorknob creaked softly. She didn't say a word. James watched from the barn, half hidden behind a beam, his arms crossed over his chest. He had done this most mornings, just watching, not in a pressing or pushing way, just quietly, with something like respect. He always returned before the house was fully in motion, arranging carrots, a few onions, and some withered greens she had pulled from the dry flower garden. She disappeared into her room again, never asking for anything, never speaking. In return, he never knocked. He left warm bread, boiled eggs, and black tea on a wooden tray outside her bedroom door each morning, steam rising in the hallway. She never took the tray while he was watching, but when he came back an hour later, the spot was always empty. This quietness had become their rhythm. Days passed like this. One morning when he went to retrieve the tray, something new was on it. A folded square linen handkerchief embroidered with delicate little red stitches. The edges were uneven but careful. A single flower bloomed in the corner. He turned it over once, then twice, his hands slowing. No words, just the thread. But it said more than silence. That evening he cooked dinner. Nothing fancy, just rabbit stew and fresh bread, and set an extra bowl on the table. Not next to his, but across from it like an invitation to the space. She didn't come, but later, when he went outside to tend to the horses, the leftover bowl was empty and clean. He smiled. That night, he didn't sleep in the barn. Instead, he took the blanket and spread it out near the hearth on the main room floor, warm enough, just far enough away not to intrude. She heard him, she always did, but she didn't object. She let the light from the fire flicker through the door. The next day, the silence between them became softer. She started to stay in the kitchen, quietly washing vegetables or drying herbs on the window hooks. She still didn't say anything, but her presence was no longer ghostly. It began to take shape. He started to notice the small changes. Her braids undone in the evening, the way she would stop when the wind blew through the trees as if for a memory, the way she never asked, but always gave something back, tidying the hearth, stacking firewood, folding the dish towels. One evening, just as the sun was melting behind the western mountains, James stood in the doorway, watching her clean the dirt from a bundle of wild onions she had gathered. She sat on the stoop, her legs tucked up, her face flushed from the day's heat. He cleared his throat. She looked up, startled, then stilled. He walked closer, slowly, as if approaching a skittish colt, and held out his hand, not to her, but just open, empty. "I don't know how much you understand," he said gently, "but your home, it's yours now if you want it. You don't have to keep packing your things. You don't have to sleep as if you're about to leave." She stared at him, unblinking. Then slowly, she bowed her head. Not in fear, but something else. Gratitude. A breath escaped her lips. Not quite a word. Her shoulders shook once, and she clutched the onions to her chest. James didn't move closer. He just gave a single nod, turned, and went inside. That night, when she walked past the main room, she saw the red embroidered handkerchief tucked neatly beside a bowl of waiting tea on the table, and next to it, another bowl folded, empty, waiting for her next message. The dry season had settled over the land like a second skin, cracked, cruel, and full of silence. The fields hadn't seen real rain in weeks, and even the chickens scratched at the earth listlessly, as if too tired to bother. But inside the farmhouse, something softer had begun to bloom. James didn't push. He never had. But each morning, he would show her how things worked. He showed patience, never raising his voice, never assuming she understood until she showed him she did. And Wanen slowly responded. They started with the chickens. James gently guided her hands, showing her how to mix the feed, oats, cornmeal, and grit, how to scatter it just right so the birds didn't peck each other to pieces. He showed her the rhythm of the work, the small details that helped the birds lay, that kept the eggs from breaking. She listened without a word, watching him intently, nodding when she understood. Sometimes she would mimic the gesture with an over-the-top slowness, waiting for his reciprocating nod. Then came the cow. He led her to the barn, where the old brown milk cow stood chewing with lazy indifference. James squatted beside it and showed it the right-hand placement, the gentle squeeze and pull, how not to yank. Wanena hesitated at first, but then she knelt, her braids falling forward, and tried. The first stream of milk went crooked. The second didn't come at all, but by the third, it was flowing correctly. She looked up at him, and he gave a wry smile. She didn't smile back, not yet, but her eyes briefly lit up. Later that week, she surprised him. She cleared a small space in the kitchen and began to cook. plantain leaves from a dried bundle she had carried in her bag. Sticky rice she ladled from a tin, ginger root she peeled and sliced with care. He watched her through the door as she soaked, wrapped, and folded. When he came closer, curious, she gestured for him to sit. Then she handed him a plantain leaf, pointed to the rice, and tapped the counter 3 times. "Understand." James tried clumsily. The leaf tore. The rice spilled out. She still didn't smile. She just took his hands and guided them, slowly, patiently, as he had guided hers. Steam from the ginger was steaming in the pot nearby. The aroma filled the cabin. That night they ate on the porch together. She gave him a bowl of sticky rice with ginger broth. He tasted it and sighed, surprised. "Good," he said. "Very good." She looked down, but her hands were still for a moment, a small bit of pride easing her shoulders. That became their pattern. He taught her what he knew. She reciprocated the gift in kind. One afternoon, the wind changed. James was stacking hay when clouds rolled in without warning. Thunder boomed in the wide-open sky, and the first drops began to fall before he could get the tools inside. Juanena was near the chicken coop, holding a small wooden bucket, when the downpour began. She gasped, partly in shock, partly in the sudden cold. James called out, waving toward the barn. They both ran, their feet sliding in the wet clay, their shirts soaked in a matter of seconds. She reached the barn first and ducked under the awning just as James rounded the corner, his boot catching on a loose board. He lurched forward, arms flailing, and fell hard into the old washtub with a splash loud enough to scare the birds. Water sprayed out like a fountain. Juanena stiffened, her eyes wide. Then she put her hand to her mouth and laughed. Not a gentle, polite laugh, a real laugh from deep in her chest. It was soft and clear, and entirely unexpected. James sat in the tub, dripping and blinking. He stared at her, stunned. Not because he was wet, but because it was the first time he'd heard her laugh. He stared as if the sound were a miracle. Her cheeks flushed. She tried to stop, but the more she looked at him, hair plastered to his forehead, shirt plastered to his chest, the more she couldn't contain her giggles. He gave a low, rusty chuckle. "Glad to see my dignity is good for something." She covered her mouth, but her eyes were shining, and just like that, the silence between them broke a little, and something new seeped through. That night, as the rain fell lightly on the roof, and the fire warmed the cabin, James sat across from her, still drying his boots, and she handed him a small cloth, one on which she had embroidered a small raindrop in red thread. He looked at it, then at her, and smiled. This time she smiled back. James returned from the fields at dusk, his hands dusty and calloused, hoping for the quiet of the evening. Inside, Juanena was sitting at the small wooden table, charcoal in hand, and a stack of papers spread out before her. The lamplight was pale, outlining her careful strokes. She looked up, startled. She hadn't expected him so early. On the top sheet was a scene he recognized even before he understood, a village in flames, the thatched roofs consumed by fire. Juanena's hand trembled slightly as she drew the smoldering embers. She turned to another page, sketching a young boy, thin, hands outstretched, his mouth clamped in a silent cry. A finely drawn necklace hung around his neck. The third drawing showed a train lumbering toward the horizon, a lone girl clutching a cloth bag in the center of a car. James cleared his throat softly. She looked away, her lips tight. He didn't ask. He just sat down beside her and watched her fold each drawing with a somber gravity, tucking them into a folded cloth. His presence was patient, waiting without pressure. When she was finished, she unfolded the largest one, the burning village, and pressed it forward. Her finger traced the flames, then moved to the girl's silhouette, holding the boy's hand in a faraway place, and then followed the train. He saw her story: loss, escape, exile. She bowed her head to the table, a ragged breath escaping, shaking the tablecloth. He waited, giving her time. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were red but steady. He reached out and smoothed the drawing, carefully tucking it into his breast pocket. His hand rested there, a silent promise that no more words were needed. She blinked in surprise. He nodded once and stood up. Afterward, by the firelight, he gathered scrap wood and went to work. He made a small wooden box, the edges sanded smooth, the shavings brushed away, a simple lid carefully carved. Inside, he placed her folded drawings, and beside them, a polished wooden comb, each tooth fine and even, crafted by his own hands. He closed it with a sense of finality and brushed the sawdust from his trousers. That night, squatting in the glow of the hearth, Wa-Nen stared into nothing, lost in memory and longing. James placed the wooden box between them. She looked up, confused. He opened the lid, revealing her drawings and the comb. He lifted the comb and pressed it into her hand. The wood was smooth, flawless, warmed by his touch. His voice was low and even. Your past doesn't have to disappear, but your future, if you want it, it can begin here. Her eyes widened as a word caught in her throat. He gently squeezed her fingers. She nodded, tears gathering, but a fragile smile formed on her lips. The next evening, as the sun set in the sky, Wa-Nen sat at the table, a small notebook open in front of her. James leaned against the door, watching. She held up a page with 2 careful English words. "Thank you." Her voice was hesitant but clear. "Thank you." He closed the notebook gently and replied, "You're welcome." After that, the evening lessons began. James admitted he had never gotten far enough to learn another language. Wa-Nen hummed hymns in Arapaho, melodies of home drifting in the quiet. He guided her through basic English, the days of the week, the names of animals, how to ask for water or warmth. She mimicked each word, a frown of concentration on her face until her pronunciation sounded right. He would clap softly. In return, she taught him to speak Arapaho. He stumbled over the complexities of its tones, but her laughter, soft, sincere, encouraged him. She taught him one evening, pointing to his chest. "Heart," he repeated until she nodded, satisfied. One morning, he found her at the door, her hair loose, her eyes bright in the morning light. He was carrying a bucket of water. She smiled and just said, "Thank you." The moment was small, but it said so much. From then on, breakfast became a shared ritual, with warm bread and tea. The wooden comb lay beside her plate as a silent emblem of their relationship. In the corner of his farm, new roots were growing, held, nurtured by mutual trust, patience, and kindness that bridged history and language. And in the quietness of the night, as the wind stirred the rafters, neither of them was alone anymore. Laramie was stirring with whispers long before the sun was fully up. News traveled fast in towns like this, faster than a train, faster than the truth. By breakfast, every saloon and dry goods store was buzzing with the same line. Morgan bought himself an Indian wife. They said it with contempt, with laughter, with disbelief. It reached every porch and poker table. Nobody cared that she was quiet or small, or that she walked with her eyes downcast. They just saw the difference and judged. By noon, Wa-Nen walked down the street for supplies. Her fringed silk scarf reflected the soft light on the dusty background. She felt the silence close in as she passed, the unnatural stillness of eyes that lingered too long, of heads that turned but said nothing. The sound of high-heeled boots, scraping against the wood, whispered behind her like a ghost. Near the saloon, the dirt road seemed to narrow, blocked by a group of drunken men whose breath reeked of whiskey, their faces flushed like slabs of beef just pulled from the fire, eyes glassy yet lit with a thick, merciless gleam, a sick thrill in seeing a defenseless prey trapped in the middle of a hungry pack. "Hey," one of them drawled, a sneer curling at the corner of his mouth, his words dripping spit. "Got any buns in that basket? Or is Morgan still keeping him? Inside you." Laughter cracked the air, dry and cutting. Another man chimed in, voice slurred and stinking of contempt. Betty down the street paid less to buy his mule. A sharp whistle split the air, shrill as a blade slicing through her dignity. Wa-Nen's fingers tightened on the handle of her woven basket, as if letting go would cause her to shatter into pieces. Her gaze dropped not out of fear, but because she knew meeting their eyes would only fan the flames of their mockery. And in the midst of their jeering, her pride burned quietly. a flame that scorched no one but her own trembling heart. She stayed silent, but it was not a meek silence. It was thick and heavy, like the sky before a storm, waiting for a single lightning strike to break it open. One of them staggered forward, boots squelching in the mud, and bent down in a mock bow, as if playing the gentleman, though his eyes leaked the same foulness as oil spreading on water. His bow was less a greeting than spitting straight in her face. "Come on, sweetheart," he dragged out the words, each syllable dropping like cold grease from a piece of overcooked meat. "Let us have a look. $50 ought to have bought something worth seeing." The words had barely left his lips before the others burst into raucous laughter, clapping their hands in sharp bursts, snorting through their noses, all of it blending into a filthy kind of music, where every note jabbed at her shame like a dull blade sawing slowly into flesh. Wanen stepped back, her heel sinking into the wet earth, the basket trembling in her grasp, not because it was heavy, but because her whole arm had drawn tight with the pounding of her heart, urging her to vanish from the circle thick with the smell of meat, sweat, whiskey, and pure human contempt. She blinked hard, swallowing down the tide of tears that had risen, refusing to let them see they'd won. But deep inside her chest, the humiliation etched itself in every word, every laugh, every filthy glance cut into her heart like a scar that would never fade. Then suddenly, he was there. James. Not a word, just his presence, just the tightening of his hand on hers, just his steel frame stepping between her and them. The crowd fell silent. James didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes, hidden under the brim of his hat, said enough. He turned away, holding Wanen close, and led her along the boardwalk. She followed, almost breathless. Back at home, the silence was still there, but it was warmer. James led her to the kitchen table. She sat in silence. He knelt to untie her sandals, gently retying them. Wanen pressed a hand to her chest, not daring to look him in the eye. Then he slowly walked across the room. From inside his jacket, he opened an old leather-bound Bible and placed it in front of her. She looked at him with confusion. He opened it. Inside was a single folded paper. Wanen stared. It was a marriage certificate, her name next to his in slow, careful English letters, signed, witnessed, real. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the paper, then lightly touched it. Her name in ink, not whispered, not passed down, written out. James said, his voice low, even, "We'll have a ceremony. If you want, not for the town. For you." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Because you deserve better than the steps. Because I believe in the person you are. And because," his voice faltered slightly, "because I love you." She pressed the certificate to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered, "I want that." James placed the paper on a clean page in the Bible, then closed it. They sat at the table, the wind blowing softly outside, the fire crackling in the hearth. He took her hand again. She didn't pull away. In that kitchen, love wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. It didn't have to be. It just was. And in Wanen's chest, something took hold, something strong and solid, and finally her own. The sun rose gently behind the mountains, painting the sky with soft pinks and yellows, as if it, too, understood the quietness of a weekend day. Under the old, sprawling oak tree behind the house, James waited. He had combed his hair, shaved carefully, and wore the black jacket he had worn to his brother's wedding nearly a decade earlier. It was tight at the shoulders now, but clean, respectful. Wanen stepped into the clearing just a few minutes later. Her dress was a simple ivory linen that had once belonged to James' late wife, altered and mended with her own patient hands. Wanen wore no veil, just a small comb carved from cedar, holding her hair away from her face. Her cheeks were flushed, not with makeup, but with the morning wind and a waiting shyness. They stood under the oak, its branches creaking gently above them, and waited in silence. The only other soul present was Pastor Moore, a retired missionary who had baptized half the valley. He wore a homespun collar, smelling faintly of tobacco and old rain. His voice, when it came, was as steady as the tree they stood under. "No choir," he said softly, flipping open a small Bible. "No pews. But the Lord listens better when there's only heart and earth." James took Juanina's hand in his, and her fingers clenched his with a slight tremor. He looked at her, not just the woman who had once trembled in the heat of the town square, but the woman who now looked back at him with a trust forged by quiet days and evenings of learning language together. "You've brought more life to this land than all the rain I've ever had," he whispered. She smiled and whispered back for the first time, "Thank you for not leaving me where they left me." Pastor Moore said the words, simple and sacred. They didn't exchange rings, but when he pronounced them husband and wife, James reached into his jacket pocket and tied a red silk ribbon around her wrist. "From your mother's basket," he murmured. "You left it in the corner cupboard." She looked down at the ribbon, touched it to her lips, and nodded. Afterward, they drank tea together from chipped porcelain cups on the porch. There were no guests, no music, just the gentle rustling of hay and the gurgling of the stream from the oak behind them. The tea was warm. The silence was enough. Then James got up, took a shovel from beside the porch, and gestured to where they had cleared the ground the day before. Together, they planted a young red plum tree. Its roots were bundled in burlap, its leaves just beginning to sprout. Juanina knelt beside him, brushing away the dirt with her bare hands, her wedding dress trailing in the soil. She whispered something in Arapaho, a blessing or maybe a prayer, and patted the earth around the roots. They watered it together. The next day, she hung a small wind chime made of bamboo by the door. It had been hidden in her trunk since she arrived, wrapped in cloth, silent until now. When the wind stirred, it made soft, high-pitched sounds, like laughter heard from a distance, or a memory made of light. Each time the chimes rang, James would look up from wherever he was, mending a fence, stirring oats, brushing a horse, and smile. That evening, as dusk settled over the land, James took a knife from his belt and walked out onto the porch. Juanina followed him, curious. He knelt on the wooden beam right next to the door and carved slowly, carefully. She stood behind him, arms crossed, her breath catching. He worked until the sun was gone, and when he stepped back, she saw what he had written. "Home of James and Juanina, where nobody sells anything." She held her breath. She touched the carving with her fingertips, tracing each letter. A single tear slid down her cheek and fell onto the fresh cut of the word home. He looked at her. "It's yours now too," he said simply. She didn't answer in words. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him from behind, rested her head between his shoulder blades, and closed her eyes. For the first time, the land was still. Not like a cage, not like a station between two ends of an escape, but still like the land before planting, like a heart ready to take root. And when the wind rose again, the bamboo chimes answered softly and clearly, as if they had finally come home.